House of Mist by Maria Luisa Bombal. Read to you by Abigail Kosnik. Prologue. I wish to inform the reader that even though this is a mystery, it is a mystery without murder. He will not find here any corpse, any detective. He will not even find a murder trial, for the simple reason that there will be no murderer. There will be no murderer and no murder, yet there will be crime, and there will be fear. For those whom fear has no attraction, those who are interested in the mysterious life people live in their dreams during sleep, those who believe that the dead are not really dead, those who are afraid of the fog and of their own hearts, they will perhaps enjoy going back to the early days of this century and entering into a strange house of mist that a young woman, very much like all other women, built for herself at the southern end of South America. Part 1. 1. The story I am about to tell is the story of my life. It begins where other stories usually end. I mean, it begins with a wedding. A really strange wedding. My own. I shall never forget that dark, empty church in the early morning, the vacillating light of the oil lamps on the altar, and myself in a pathetic black dress. Only the little bunch of artificial orange blossoms pinned to the bodice of my dress by the good nurse who had brought me up made me look like a bride. The sacred rites of the marriage ceremony were pronounced so hastily by a priest seemingly so indifferent that Daniel and I found ourselves made man and wife without having even realized just at what moment we had said the word yes. Then came our exit through a side door with our two witnesses, the judge and his clerk, in place of an escort. I remember, once we were outside the church, how the sight of my miserable little trunk laid on the front of the carriage, which was to take us to the railroad station, had suddenly made me feel quite ashamed. I remember that long train, moving heavily, always and ever toward the south, across plains and between hills, then finally that other solitary station, lost there in a desolate countryside, where we were the only ones to get off. A little peasant, hardly more than a child, was waiting for us with horses and carriage. For an instant, amazement seemed to nail him to the ground, and Daniel ordered stiffly, "Open the door and help your new lady, Andres." The last stage of our journey to the hacienda was made in an awkward carriage, both luxurious and old-fashioned. Hours seemed to pass, until, at last, I heard Daniel say, "We are arriving. Here comes the mist." From the end of the horizon, where the big forests were beginning to spread out and across the dreary brown plain where giant brambles stood motionless, crouching in the shadows like huge, frightened beasts, the mist was actually pushing forward to meet the carriage. At first, its early clouds seemed to float lazily around, dimming the window panes. Then the horses entered knee-deep into the soft, flaky waves it was unfurling in front of them, as if out of the ground itself. Finally, horses and carriage plunged entirely into a silent world where the mist stood still, suspended in space, in rows of impalpable curtains. I hid my face on my husband's shoulder. "I'm so happy," I said. But Daniel remained unmoved, distant, indifferent to the weight of my loving head on his heart, while the carriage went forward into the mist. And as I lay close to this tall, taciturn, handsome young man who was now my husband, all at once came back to me the strange past by which we were now bound together to share the same house and the same destiny. 2. What are you doing in my garden? I could see myself leaning over the curbstone of an abandoned well, looking up amazed to find standing before me a boy with rough, curly, brown hair and eyes of an intense chestnut color, Daniel at the age of 12. He was so big and strong that all of a sudden I felt very small, much smaller than I actually was for my 7 years. "Your garden?" I repeated, astonished. To my mind, the vast, abandoned, bramble-filled garden which extended all around us was a forest. The word garden, I thought, could be applied only to the carefully tended lawns like those around the house next door, my uncle's house, where I was living. "Which way did you come in?" the boy asked. I pointed broadly at the widely spaced bars of the gate, covered with growing vines, which separated the two estates. But I was unable to explain that ever since I could remember I had been coming through those bars without ever having found a living soul in the forest. "And what were you doing there leaning over this well?" he continued harshly. Terrified, that strange boy looked exactly like the enchanted bear in my fairy tales. I answered shyly, "I was looking for the prince." "What prince?" "Prince Toad. The one who has a small golden crown on top of his head. Help me pull up this pail. Maybe he's inside it," I added hurriedly, thinking in my fright that if I found the prince there, he might protect me from the anger of the bear. But the bear now looked astonished and quite friendly. "Tell me, little idiot, how do you know that kind of a toad exists?" "Because I read about him in my books." "In what books?" "In the storybooks my mother left me." "Is your mother dead?" he said brutally, as if he were enjoying it. "Yes, and my father is too. I'm an orphan," I explained in a low voice, almost ashamed. "So am I," the boy said simply. I looked at him, surprised and relieved. "You're not a bear, then?" "What bear?" "The ones in my stories. The one who is master of the forest." "How silly! Of course I'm not a bear," he said crossly. "And besides, this is not a forest, it's my garden, the garden of the house my parents left me. They left books to you, didn't they? Well, to me they left this house and this garden. Do you understand?" "Yes, so you're an orphan too," I exclaimed in delight, suddenly realizing that there could be other orphans in the world beside myself. That's it. Now let's look for that prince," he interrupted, cutting short abruptly the flow of my joy. The chain of the old well was rusty, and we had to work a long time before we succeeded in pulling up the pail filled with mud. "Here he is," my companion cried, plunging his fingers inside the pail. "Here he is. I have him, your prince." Alas, it was only a frog. "Tell me, little idiot, I don't see any golden crown on his head." "Because he isn't the prince, but still, that little frog looks very pretty. See, it doesn't have a golden crown, but has eyes with gold on them. Look at it." "You're making fun of me," Daniel cried, throwing the poor beast savagely into the brambles. "Oh, you're mean," I stammered, my eyes filled with tears. "Of course I'm mean," he replied violently. "Didn't you say I was a bear?" He hurled himself upon me, and in no time I found myself lifted from the ground and swept away in a wild race around the trees. Scared and unsteady on the shoulders of the bear, I held on to his hair. He dropped me to the ground with a cry of pain. "You nasty brat!" He moved away angrily. "Come on, bear, come on. Don't be angry. Let's play again," I pleaded. "No, I won't. You're afraid, just like all the other girls." "I won't be any more. Not any more, I promise. Be the bear again, just once. It's fun." "Well, perhaps tomorrow. Now it's time for me to go to school." "Don't go." "You're crazy. I must go. It's only because I have to go to school that I came to live in this house. Otherwise, I'd have stayed at the hacienda with my uncle." "So you have an uncle too?" "Of course, my uncle Manuel." He is my uncle, my godfather, and my guardian all at the same time, and he says that he will leave all his haciendas to me when he dies. Then I will supervise the mills and ride horseback all day, hop, hop, hop. And you," he suddenly spoke out again, cutting short his own effervescence, "don't you go to school too?" "No." "I see. You're too small." "I'm almost 8, I retorted smartly. "Then if you don't go, it's because you're lazy." "No, I can't go because I'm an orphan," I declared gravely. "Well, that's funny. My sister, who is an orphan just like you, has been going to school for a long time. Uncle Manuel sends her to school in Europe. Tell me, little idiot, I'll bet you don't even know where Europe is." 3. "Aunt Mercedes, I'd like to go to school with Teresa." Teresa was my cousin and the only daughter of Aunt Mercedes and Uncle Arturo, my guardians. "Don't you know that little girls who are orphans never go to school?" "But why?" "Because that's the way things are. Please don't sit on my lap. You interfere with my knitting." "But Aunt Mercedes, the sister of the big boy next door, is an orphan like me, and she goes to school. The boy himself told me that their Uncle Manuel sends her to school far away in Europe." "Arturo, do you hear what this child is saying? It seems that Manuel Viana has decided after all to spend a few pennies on the education of his niece." "Why, yes, he sends the girl to school abroad and the boy to school here," I yell at the top of my voice. "And if they go to school and are orphans like me, why can't I go to school too, Aunt Mercedes?" "Because it's different in your case." "But why is it different?" "You'll know all about it some day when you're grown up. But for the present, I must ask you to go look for Mamita and tell her never to let you come in the drawing room when you're just back from playing in the garden next door. Look at your shoes all covered with mud, and my poor carpet." "You'll know all about it when you're grown up." Those words, coming back at me in almost everything that concerned me, appeared to be the most serious drawback to being an orphan. "I'd like to take piano lessons like Teresa." "It's not possible." "Why?" "You'll know some day when you're grown up." "I'd like to go to the fancy dress party with Teresa." "You're not invited." "Why?" "Because that's the way it is. You'll understand later when you're grown up." "I'd like to have a picture of my mother." "Doesn't the picture of your father satisfy you?" "Why, yes, Aunt Mercedes, of course I like the picture of my father. I'm glad to know my father was so handsome, so blond, and that his eyes had such a kind look, but I should also very much like to know how my mother looked." "She was a brunette, like you, and she had very dark eyes, just like yours." "Did you know her, Aunt Mercedes?" "Good gracious, no. But everybody says that's how she looked." "Would you let me see a picture, Aunt Mercedes?" "Impossible. We don't have a single picture of her in the family." "But why?" "Well, it will be explained to you when you're grown up." My aunt's frivolous, reproachful, and always hostile attitude toward me didn't make me particularly unhappy, nor did the selfishness of my little cousin, who was never willing to play with me, nor even the lack of affection shown me by my Uncle Arturo, who ignored me completely, except when once in a while he would give me a slightly embarrassed look, as if he felt ashamed to have under his roof the orphan daughter of his own brother. To compensate for all this indifference, however, I had the steady and tender love of Mamita, the good nurse in whose care I was placed when, as an orphan 5 years old, I was brought from the capital to his house in a far-off southern town. I also had the storybooks left me by my mother, from which a teacher, coming especially for me, had taught me to read. Then there were the linen room, the laundry, the kitchen, the hothouses, and the stables to amuse myself in, all very exciting places where something always seemed to be happening. But above all, from the day when the recollection of my sad childhood begins, in the bushy garden at the house next door I had the intermittent, capricious friendship of a big chestnut-colored bear. 4. Elga? So your name is Elga? What a funny name. It's the name of the daughter of the Marsh King and of an Egyptian princess. Not really. Yes, and their stories in my books. Imagine, one day the princess was sitting on the shore of a kind of lake in the middle of the bog, when suddenly she saw a stump turn around and stretch out its long miry branches like arms. It was the Marsh King himself who lives in the bog. Oh no! Terrified, the poor princess sprang away into the shaking quagmire, and she sank at once, and the alder stump after her. It was dragging her down. Isn't it frightening? Yes, very frightening. But tell me, didn't you make up all those silly tales yourself? Of course not. That story is from one of my books, and it isn't a silly tale. Every one of the things that is told in my storybooks happened once upon a time. Well, then, why don't they happen any more? Why haven't we ever found your Prince Toad, for instance? We will find him after a while, if we're patient. But I'm tired of running after him, and tired of waiting for the appearance of that famous fairy with hair as blonde as wheat and eyes as blue as sapphires. Listen, do you hear? Somebody is playing the piano at your house. That's my cousin. She began taking her lessons at home yesterday. If you want to come into our garden, we'll look at her through the windows of the veranda, and we'll watch her doing her practicing. Let's, Daniel magnanimously acquiesced. And, look, he exclaimed 5 minutes after, his forehead glued to the window pane of the veranda. It's the fairy. Who? Your cousin. She is the fairy. She has hair as blonde as wheat and eyes as blue as sapphires. How beautiful she is! Oh my, how beautiful! Yes, little Teresa was indeed beautiful, and she became more and more beautiful as she grew up. Her deep blue eyes livened up with gold spangles, her light blonde hair turned into molten gold, and her delicate complexion acquired a warm golden hue. So thus resplendent, in the midst of others, she seemed always enfolded and held in a ray of sunlight. Teresa. Her parents were infatuated with her. People on the streets stopped to watch her go by. And, as for me, I became almost silly with excitement whenever she condescended to ask me to turn the pages of her music while she was playing the piano. There was nothing indeed that Teresa could do except play the piano and look beautiful. Yet somehow I felt that to be so beautiful might be the task God assigned to certain people. Their beauty, some kind of message or mission from him that they must carry. And thus to me, Teresa, so slim, harmonious, and golden, was like a spring, a cool, babbling spring close to which one felt a great contentment and a great desire to be good. 5. From the moment he saw her through the windows of the veranda, Teresa became the object of Daniel's admiration and purest passion. I did not feel jealous of her. No, quite the contrary. Daniel's love for Teresa made my friendship absolutely indispensable to him, for I was the only one who could from day to day give him an accurate report of everything concerning her. Thus that love became the big secret shared between us, and it was to unite us for many years in lengthy conversations and in plans elaborately prepared, even though they always seemed to go amiss through Daniel's cowardice. So many times it happened that on the day Teresa was to carry her big dictionaries to school, Daniel, as he saw her coming, would quickly vanish instead of offering her his help, as I had suggested he should do. Once he stupidly remained hidden behind the big rhododendron where I had succeeded in dragging my cousin, that he might unexpectedly appear and throw himself at her feet to present to her as a gift the pearl cufflinks he had stolen from Uncle Manuel. "But, Daniel, why? After this had all been arranged, why didn't you do it?" "Because I don't know what happened to me. Because maybe I'm just a wild country boy, and I'll always be wild, like Uncle Manuel. At least that's what he tells me himself. That's what the principal at school tells me." And as it turned out, both Uncle Manuel and the principal were quite right in their expectations. 6. Poor Judge Rivas. Manuel Viana did him a very poor turn when he gave him the guardianship of his nephew and niece. I can still hear Aunt Mercedes a few years later saying in her high-pitched voice, "Imagine, Arturo, Señora Rivas was telling me that the boy did not want to go back to college after the death of his uncle, that he's living at the hacienda wearing spurs or sandals like a peasant, that he is a hard worker but a miser as exacting as his uncle was, the only difference being that Manuel Viana was saving his money so that he could waste it on his famous collection of books and rugs now rotting away in the mist at the hacienda, whereas the boy only saves to buy more and more land. They say that his woods, his lands, are like a mania with him. It seems that he even bought from his sister a large part of the lands she inherited under the will. And by the way, Arturo, do you know that they do not get along at all, even though they're twins? Señora Rivas told me that the judge tried in vain to make him go to Europe to attend the wedding of his sister who married a count. It seems that the boy refused to go because, he said, the man was marrying his sister for her money. Just as if a real count couldn't ever marry the little Viana girl for anything but her money. But Aunt Mercedes, she's very pretty. She dresses well and dances beautifully. Daniel himself told me so. Well, that's fantastic. Anyway, what do you think of a boy of 17 whose best friend is a child of 12 like Elga? Wouldn't you say, Arturo, that the boy is slightly backward?" At that point, Uncle Arturo, instead of answering, gave her one of his frigid glances that automatically made him stop the flow of her commentaries and turn upon anyone unfortunate enough to be close to her. "Go to bed, Elga. Who gave you permission to stay up so late these past few days?" "But, Auntie, you know I prefer to go up at the same time as Teresa. I like so much to help her fix her hair for the night. Don't you want me to help you brush your hair and make up your braids, Teresa?" "Certainly," Teresa answered mechanically, with her usual adorable and distant smile. 7. Daniel, do you know that last night Teresa let me help her brush her hair again? If only you could see her hair when it's undone. Oh, Daniel, it's like a golden shower, and soft to the touch as if it were made out of silk. "Really?" Daniel whispered. "Besides, you know, when it has been carefully brushed, it's made up into 2 long braids, and they are heavy and slippery, like 2 beautiful snakes. I'm sure that if they were cut off, they would still keep alive by themselves." "That's it!" Daniel cried so unexpectedly that it startled me. "Elga," he added, and he took hold of my wrist. "Elga, tell me, do you love me?" "Of course, but don't hold my arm so tightly. You're hurting me." "Elga, if it's true that you love me, tonight you will take the big scissors that are kept in your aunt's workbox, the ones you were forbidden to use to cut out your pictures, do you remember? And with them you will cut off Teresa's braids." "Cut off Teresa's braids!" I exclaimed, horrified. In the same tone I might have said, "Cut off Teresa's head." "Yes, and you will bring them here to me. Then I'll be able to touch them and hold them as you do, and it will be almost as if I had Teresa with me always, everywhere, all the time. Elga, would you do that for me?" "Oh, no, I never could. Oh, Daniel, Listen to me. It's very easy. First, you steal the scissors during the day. Then, at night, while Teresa is asleep, you quickly cut off one braid with a big sweep of the scissors. After all, one is enough for me. Then you run into your room, hide it under your pillow, pretend to be asleep, and bring it to me here the next morning, hidden under your apron. Now, do you understand? You see, it's really quite easy. Yes, but when Teresa wakes up and sees, she won't know who did it. And if she wakes up while just do it quickly. One stroke of the scissors, and you run, in the dark, so she won't be able to notice who did it. Oh, Daniel, I never could, I said to him the next day. I went as far as to steal the scissors, and here they are. But never, never will I dare cut Teresa's beautiful hair. Oh, Daniel, couldn't you take my braids instead? I will cut them off here right for you, if you like. Daniel gave me a short, contemptuous laugh. Your braids? What would I do with your braids? I don't like black hair anyway. Besides, you're not the one I'm in love with. It's Teresa. I know, but Daniel, I continued imploringly, you know I could never do that. It's not right. You will do it for me, if you love me. I do love you, but... No, you don't love me. The very first time I ask you to do something for me, you're not willing to do it. After all, a friendship with a girl is never any use. I'm disgusted with you, that's all. Goodbye. No, no, I moaned, trying to hold him back through the bars of the gates, where most of our meetings took place. Let me go. I don't want to ever see you again. No, no, I'll do what you want, but don't get angry. Don't leave me, please, Daniel. You'll do it this evening, then, will you? This very evening, so that I can take the braid with me to the hacienda. I'm going there tomorrow. It's promised, then, is it? With a dry throat and eyes filled with tears, I nodded in panic. Then, leaning over to my cheek, across the bars, Daniel kissed me for the first time. You're brave, Elga, he said, as brave as a boy. 8. It was both that kiss and that declaration which held up my faltering steps as I went to Teresa's room that evening. They gave my trembling hands the strength to accomplish the act which was to change the course of my life. Teresa was asleep. With one breath, I blew out the night lamp on her side table. Then, leaning over the bed, I searched with my hand among the pillows, and, finally, taking hold of one of her braids, I slipped the scissors close to the roots of her hair. But, alas, I was very soon to realize that it was quite impossible to cut a thick braid with a single quick stroke of the scissors. The hair kept slipping between the blades, and the work was progressing very slowly. Teresa began to toss about. I stopped cutting. My heart was throbbing. When I forced myself to go on, I did so clumsily that I prickled her in the neck with the point of the scissors. She came half awake then, and, drawing herself up, stretched out her hands in the dark. At that moment, I lost my head. Wildly, I made up my mind to complete the job all at once, and throwing myself on Teresa, I began to cut as best as I could while she, now fully awake, started to scream loudly enough to awake an entire city. I was lost. I knew it immediately, and did not even attempt to escape. And thus it was, they found me standing in my long nightgown at the head of Teresa's bed, shaking like a leaf. My right hand was still clutching the big scissors, and from my left hand, tightly held, hung long tufts of blonde hair, while my cousin, disheveled, cheek bleeding, was screaming like Mateo and Tadeo, our favorite little pigs we had once heard being killed. 9. A monster! Jealousy! Depraved mentality! Bad natural instincts! Later she'll want not only to disfigure her cousin, but perhaps also to kill her. It might be necessary to send her away forever. Oh, God, what can be done with such an unfortunate child? She's too young to be locked up. But in any case, we must get in touch with Adelaida, After all, she's your older sister, Arturo, and this child is as much her niece as yours. She certainly should look after her now. Besides, Adelaida lives alone. She's no longer a little girl and should not forever dodge her responsibilities." Those were the comments I overheard from my room, where I was kept locked up like a dangerous beast. "The reason, unfortunate child. Tell us the reason that made you do such a thing. Please answer. Say anything. Did you really hate your little cousin without saying a word about it, just because she is prettier than you? Why don't you answer? Won't you please answer? Really, it's enough to drive one mad. She won't even answer. She keeps silent all the time, Doctor. And she doesn't even cry, Doctor. Just like a criminal, like the most hardened criminal." Yes, I remained heroically silent regarding the motive of my offense. I did not even confess it to Mamita, for I was afraid that in order to exonerate me, she might repeat everything to my aunt. But whenever I found myself alone, I would run to the window to take a look through the trees at Daniel's window. Any kind of sign from him would have been all I needed to make me understand that he knew I tried to fulfill my promise to him. But his window remained closed and dark, and I never found out whether or not he understood. For one morning at dawn, a carriage drove Mamita and me to the railroad station. From there, Uncle Arturo shipped us away to the big city where I was born, and where Aunt Adelaida was henceforth to assume full charge of my troublesome little person. 10. Yes, Aunt Adelaida, the only sister of my father and Uncle Arturo, was no longer a young girl, as Aunt Mercedes had so loudly proclaimed. She was, and probably had been for a long time, just an old maid. It was now from Aunt Adelaida that I learned Aunt Mercedes was no more than a silly, plebeian, provincial girl, whom Uncle Arturo had been foolish enough to marry for her good looks, long since vanished, and for her fortune, which he had thrown away at the gaming tables. Nevertheless, he had remained a prisoner of that marriage to a person of a lower class. For Aunt Adelaida emphasized that he had married a person of a lower class. Yes, she, Adelaida, had suffered a great deal on account of her brothers, and in order that I might appreciate the full extent of her kindness to me, I should know that it was on account of them that she had remained a spinster. For when she was a young girl, of an aristocratic and wealthy family, she could, at the time she made her debut, have married anyone she wanted. But her parents had died very soon afterwards, and later on her two brothers had ruined her, Uncle Arturo financially by squandering all the family fortune at gambling, and my father socially by the terrible scandal of which I would be told when you were grown up. "The poor dear lady," Mamita would sigh. "It is indeed fortunate that God gave her so many excuses to deceive herself. If it had not been for her brother's folly, no doubt by looking at herself in the mirror she might have understood why nobody wanted to marry her." Bursts of laughter from the two servants resounded, followed by an abrupt silence when the steps of the poor dear lady were heard. "Quiet! Be careful! She is making her daily round," they warned. "When she is not walking around with a broom in her hand, she is flying seated on top of it," they added, chuckling like two schoolgirls. And even though it seemed terrible, one had to admit that poor Aunt Adelaida, so very long and thin, with her big colorless eyes staring into space, with her profile like a bird of prey, was indeed the striking image of one of the witches in my books. Happily, she made use of her time in a manner entirely different from a witch. Aunt Adelaida spent her mornings in church and her afternoons in bed, suffering from the same heart ailment which had been fatal to my father. Her unsatisfactory state of health, however, did not prevent her from receiving a large company of people, who talked, intrigued, and gossiped while they drank tea around the large silver brazier standing close to her bed. Only when everybody else had gone, and her two oldest friends remained with her, was I called in and allowed to take my place near the brazier with my embroidery. for my aunt had made up her mind that I should learn to sew and to embroider as a means of earning my living later on. "Considering that this child cannot possibly ever think of getting married," she would say, "Mother Maria de los Angeles has promised me to take her in the linen room of the convent." One day, however, I ventured to mention that I would like so much to be able to play the piano. A horrified response from my aunt cut short my suggestion. "Well, that would be the last straw! You, an artist!" And so it happened that learning to sew and to embroider became very soon the main object of my course of studies at the convent, where, to my keen disappointment, I was never allowed to join with other children in the classes, but instead was given only private instruction. This strange isolation, the reason for which was to be explained later when you were grown up, did not in any way hinder the flight of my imagination nor my passionate love of life. I enjoyed my embroidery very much, and I liked having people go into ecstasies over the perfection and the elegance of my work. But since Mamita, who was suffering from rheumatism, had to go back to her province, and I had to sleep alone in one of the wings of the enormous old house, it was with the people of my fairy tales, and in their world, that I found shelter during the night. What a glorious achievement it would be for humanity to understand that each one of us has within himself a well into which he can descend during sleep, and by means of which he can escape into infinity. For was not God himself standing at the top of the holy ladder of light, with angels moving up and down, when Jacob reached the bottom of it during his sleep? Actually, it was deep down in the magic countries of my storybooks that my own well descended, and far into them that it led me. Soon after I had fallen asleep, I usually found myself in a dark forest, where I never failed to take the lost path that came out at the grotto, where the good Princess Eliza was knitting with her poor bruised hands the 12 tunics of nettle which were to give back their human forms to the 12 swans, her brothers. Or else I was among the 5 little sirens, sisters of the one who fell in love with a young prince of the earth, and gave up her palace of pearls, her beautiful algae-colored tail, and her enchanting voice, so as to be able to live with him. During the night, when all in her earthly palace was at rest, the poor little mermaid would come walking down the marble steps to cool her tiny burning feet in the deep waters of the sea. Her sisters would then swim up to the spot in order to sing for her, and I was there singing with them. Other times, the moment I fell asleep, I would find myself among a great throng of people gathered on the principal street in a city of the Middle Ages, looking in wonderment at the retinue of the Princess Cruel as she went by. 12 fair young girls, each clad in a white silk robe and bearing a golden tulip in her hand, rode on coal-black steeds before or beside her. The princess herself had a snow-white palfrey. The gold crown that pressed her rich dark tresses seemed made of stars, and the light gauze-like mantle that robed her shoulders was composed of many thousand various-hued butterfly wings. And she was so beautiful that, forgetting how cruel she was, the crowd cheered her wildly as she passed by, and I would cheer with the crowd. Quite often I found myself gliding over vast steppes in the great white sleigh of the terrible Snow Queen, with Kay, the handsome young man whom she had stolen from his fiancé, sitting by my side. And it happened that Kay resembled Daniel in a striking manner. And because Kay was so much like Daniel, that silent and frozen world in which the Snow Queen took us, driving, was the world into which I preferred to descend during my sleep. For the memory of Daniel was growing in me day after day instead of receding. At first it brought me regret. Then it was my haven in loneliness. Gradually it changed into my dream of every day, becoming later my only source of happiness. From that time on, my unconscious sentiment for him grew into conscious and passionate love. Daniel was now my only sweet secret. It was his name I wrote on the window panes that the early winter frost tarnished. His name I silently called 3 times whenever I saw a shooting star fall in the star-swarmed skies at summertime. And no longer did I feel afraid of the future, for suddenly I decided that sooner or later Daniel must come to take me away, no matter what might be the mystery overshadowing my life. That mystery, as a matter of fact, was going to be unexpectedly cleared up long before the time when I was grown up. 11. It happened late one afternoon, as the rain was falling hard upon the roofs of the town. I was sewing in my aunt's room while she dozed, very much disappointed at not having received a single visitor all day, when the doorbell sounded downstairs. My aunt straightened herself up on her pillows and tried to figure out who could be brave enough to call on her in the rain so late in the afternoon. Suddenly we heard a frightened cry from the maid who had gone down to open the front door, and someone coming up the stairs in a great hurry. Almost immediately a woman was there, standing motionless and haughty on the threshold. She was a tall, very slender woman, dressed all in black. From behind a thin veil, her cold, grey eyes were staring hard at me. "Good evening, Elena," I heard my aunt say at last in a halting voice. Without even condescending to answer her, the tall woman walked up to me, the picture of a beautiful, threatening archangel, and I felt her long, gloved hand come down with crushing force on my shoulder. "So you are Enrique's daughter?" she asked in a voice hoarse and trembling. I remained silent while she turned to my aunt. "So, Adelaida, what I was told, yet could not believe, was true. You have actually taken the illegitimate daughter of your brother into your home, and were hiding it from me?" "Go away, Elga," my aunt commanded me. But I was not able to obey her, for the hand of the stranger was pressing more and more heavily on my shoulder. "You are making a fool of me, and everybody knows it, Adelaida. You are deceiving me with the same cruelty with which your brother deceived me all through his life. You—" "We have had enough of drama, Elena," interrupted my aunt. "I did everything I could in order not to hurt your feelings, but I was wrong. I should have said, in the first place, that this is the daughter of my brother, and that I owe her a minimum of protection." "And to me, the legitimate wife of your brother, to me, your sister-in-law, and your childhood friend, don't you owe a minimum of respect?" the stranger suddenly burst out. "Do you think you should have done me the indignity of taking under your roof the daughter of the woman for whom my husband publicly ridiculed and forsook me?" And as her hand at last loosened its grip on my shoulder, my father's wife collapsed on the carpet, sobbing hysterically. Her smart little hat slipped back on her head. I noticed then that she had grey hair and a fading complexion, and that notwithstanding her delicate profile and slender waist, she was almost an old woman. "Elga, go away, I tell you!" Aunt Adelaida shouted at me, finally making up her mind to jump out of bed in order to assist her sister-in-law. However, when she called me back to her room a few hours later, she was once more in bed, looking so pale and tired that I realized at last her heart disease was quite real, and not a comedy, as most people were saying behind her back. "Sit down, Elga. God only knows how many times I have put off this moment, always fearing you might be too young to learn the circumstances of your birth. But, considering what you have heard this afternoon, I feel it is my duty to tell you now, this very evening, the sad story of your parents." However, the story of my parents was not sad. It was a love story of a young bride, the wife of a Danish ship-owner on a visit to this country, and of a young man, like many others, sentimental and socially prominent. They met at a ball and fell madly in love with each other. The husband went back to Europe, but, to the great scandal of the entire city, his young wife remained here in a lovely, secluded house enclosed in a big park, waiting by night and by day for the visits, always too brief, of the man she adored and who shared her love, yet had not separated from his wife. For Elena, it seemed, had tried to poison herself when my father told her he wanted to leave her. Then, never having fully recovered, she had almost lost her mind. And that is how my father had come to pledge to himself that he would never forsake her. In the meantime, a little girl was born to the young foreigner, and she was given the name of Elga. Afterwards, only for a few short years was the young woman able to drag on her fragile charm and broken health. One morning, having been called post-haste by the servants of the beautiful villa, my father arrived just in time to be informed that the young woman had died alone in the middle of the night. And it so happened that when the hour came to lay her in her coffin, and when for the last time he was kissing her lips, he suddenly collapsed on her dead bosom, as if struck by lightning. "He died of love," I cried. "No, of a heart attack," corrected Aunt Adelaida, obviously shocked by the keen interest with which, without sorrow and without shame, I was learning at last the secret of my birth. For it happened that as she was speaking, I understood quite clearly that to live a great love, with its joys and its pains, and to die from it, might well be a destiny assigned by God to certain people, and that, contrary to what Aunt Adelaida was telling me, my parents had not committed a crime, but bravely fulfilled their mission in life. This truth, which my mind had so clearly grasped, the awkward language of my 15 years, however, could only be expressed by, "Oh, Aunt Adelaida, how marvelous it is that they died in that way. Wouldn't you also wish that you had lived such a great love?" Aunt Adelaida jumped as if bitten by a snake. "No," she threw violently in my face. "No, I would never want to bring into the world a girl for whom my guilty love would always be a bar to happiness." With that outburst, she killed my simple joy. Her argument seemed to me unanswerable, and it broke my heart. Speechless, overcome, I sprang to my feet, ran to my room, closed the door, and threw myself to the bed. For a long time I cried. I cried until finally I fell asleep exhausted. Then a gentle breath of spring came to me out of the depth of my slumber, and in my dream suddenly I found myself under a tree in bloom, laden with bees. The subtle perfume emanating from its golden branches, together with the melodious humming of the bees, started gradually to soothe my sorrow, and to fill me with an indefinable well-being, a soft, deep joy such as I had never known in all my brief existence. "This is happiness," I said ecstatically. "Yes, and that happiness will be yours," I heard a woman's voice whispering close to me. "Under this tree and in my dreams, perhaps, but not up there in life, for Aunt Adelaida told me so." "Yet you will find this tree in your own life, Elga." As I turned around to see who was talking to me, I found myself facing a frail, adorable young girl dressed all in white. Her long hair was flowing over her shoulders, and her large dark eyes were as soft as those of a deer. "You will find your happiness under this tree some day, I promise you," she repeated with a smile, and that smile carried such tenderness that I woke up in great joy and peace. Aunt Adelaida, already dressed for church, was standing at the foot of my bed. She looked embarrassed, and did not appear to notice that I had not taken off my clothes all night. "Elga," she said to me, "I remember that once you had asked me for a picture of your mother. Here is the only one we have ever had. It was taken when she was already very ill, but nevertheless you will see that she was very pretty, and that you have the same eyes she had." And leaving me utterly amazed, Aunt Adelaida hastily went out of the room, after having dropped the portrait in my hands. I looked at it, and could not help a cry of surprise. A frail, adorable young girl dressed all in white, with long hair flowing over her shoulders, and dark, soft eyes like those of a deer, was looking at me from the portrait with the same tenderness she showed me in the dream. For it was indeed my mother who had promised me happiness under the blossoming tree. And there, as in her picture, it was her extreme youth which appealed to me most. Deeply moved, I told myself that I would grow up and become old, but that my mother would remain forever slender and frail, waiting for me under the tree. And I was almost grateful for her for having died so young, so pretty. 12. My 17th year brought an event never to be forgotten, Teresa's first ball. When, in order to display the star just appearing on the family horizon, Aunt Adelaida decided to invite her beautiful niece from the province and to reopen the drawing rooms of her house, she did not realize to what extent this ball given for Teresa was going to change the course of her life, and of mine. My first meeting with my cousin after those 5 years did not precipitate the painful scene I had imagined, and I did not have to ask her forgiveness for the past, as Aunt Adelaida had suggested I do. Standing in the middle of the room which had been prepared for her, and which I had decorated myself with large bunches of blue iris, Teresa ran to meet me and kissed me warmly as soon as she saw me appear bashfully on the threshold. "Elga, how nice of you! Aunt Adelaida was just telling me that you were the one who arranged this room for me, and I noticed that you didn't forget I adore blue." I looked at her unable to answer, not even able to return a kiss, for I had forgotten how extraordinarily beautiful Teresa was. Yes, she was always more beautiful than the most idealized memory could retain of her. In order to describe her, comparisons and images, even those most worn out, most excessive, would come to one's lips. Yet, when applied to her, all those hackneyed phrases seemed to regain their strength, their full meaning. And thus it was possible, effectively, to say of Teresa that she was as exquisite and pink as the dawn, as glamorous as a radiant noon, as slender and haughty as Diana the huntress, and that her hair, the hair I had mangled in those days long ago, and which I helped on the evening of the ball to put up on her forehead in a crown of tresses, flowed through the fingers like a miraculous cascade of fluid gold. How happy I was when Teresa allowed me to be her attendant on the evening of the big ball. It was I who helped her put on the hyacinth blue dress that Aunt Adelaida had ordered from Paris for her. I who put on her feet the tiniest green golden slippers with the highest heels I had ever seen. I who clasped around her neck the famous necklace of fine pearls, which as little girls we had much admired in the jewel case of Aunt Mercedes, which she only opened for special occasions. And it was I still who handed her at last minute the little handkerchief perfumed with cypher, which she had forgotten on the dressing-table. How grateful I was for the kiss she threw me as she went by, ready to descend the main staircase to the first strains of the orchestra. I have never known a success equal to that won by Teresa on the night of her first ball. Leaning over the ramp on the landing, I saw her waltzing to the strains of the violins under the ecstatic gaze of the whole ensemblage. And there I remained almost the entire night, dancing too in my thoughts, but only with one, just one dancer, Daniel, and he was so tall and I so small that my cheek rested on his heart while he held me in his close embrace. No, nothing could be compared to Teresa's success. She was instantly acclaimed Queen of the Season. Consequently, the spacious drawing-rooms of our house remained open in anticipation of the brilliant marriage Teresa was to make, a match worthy of Aunt Adelaida's ambitions. And it was in vain that from her distant province Aunt Mercedes dispatched one letter after another asking for the return of her daughter. Her jealousy, because a sister-in-law whom she hated, was giving her daughter the social position and the entertainments she herself was unable to give her, did not, however, find any echo in Uncle Arturo, who was secretly encouraging his sister's course of action. In the meantime, very naturally, and to my complete satisfaction, I became the companion and private maid of my cousin. Every morning it was my custom to awaken her by placing on her pillow the flowers sent by her admirers. I dressed her 3 times a day, and sewed and pressed for her all afternoon. But it was in the evening, when I brushed her beautiful hair before putting her to bed, that we had a chance to talk, and she would tell me about her successes while looking at herself in the mirror, humming a tune from a waltz dedicated to her by its composer. It was in such an atmosphere of joy and confidence that she suddenly asked me one day, "Elga, why did you try to cut off my braids that time long ago? Was it because you hated me?" "No, oh no," I protested, and the brush almost slipped out of my fingers. "No, Teresa, I never hated you, I swear." "But then why did you—" A wild desire took hold of me to pronounce that name for which so many years was burning my heart day and night. "To carry them to Daniel," I heard myself saying. "To Daniel? You mean your friend, Daniel Viana, our neighbor?" "Yes, that's it. Daniel was madly in love with you, and since I had his confidence, he asked me to cut off one of your braids, because he did not dare go near you, and then, because he could not live without you, so that— Oh, Elga, that's really funny. That wild boy, that bear, in love with me, and asking you, a child, to— Oh, Elga, I can't get over it. It's really too amusing. And her beautiful, pearly laughter echoed in the silence of the great house. "Hush!" I exclaimed, looking toward the door, afraid that Aunt Adelaida might suddenly appear in her dressing gown and send me scampering to bed. Teresa stopped laughing, then with a voice playful and with increasing curiosity, "But you, Elga, why did you listen to that boy, and why did you let yourself be accused later?" "Oh, I don't know. Perhaps I was afraid of him. After all, I was only a child, and he was— By the way, how is he now, Teresa?" "Exactly the same, I suppose. I meet him sometimes, but I never look at him. However, from now on, I will look at him, you may be sure, now that I know that." And her laughter rocketed once more, and not daring to reveal my love, I laughed with her, in a cowardly way, at the handsome boy whom I adored. However, the social season was drawing to a close, and much to the annoyance of Aunt Adelaida, Teresa was turning down one after the other all proposals of marriage, until suddenly one evening, on her return from a ball, where she had been a sensation in a lovely dress of moonlight blue, she announced that she wanted to go back to her mother for a while. She left. A few weeks later, Aunt Mercedes informed Aunt Adelaida by letter of a coming engagement of her daughter to a young man of their acquaintance, handsome, rich, and of good family. "So much the better for her," concluded Aunt Adelaida, as she told me of the event. "After all, Mercedes's daughter could only marry someone of her own station." Then, after she read to me the postscript, in which Aunt Mercedes asked if I could come help prepare, with my fairy's hands, my cousin's trousseau, "You will go," she said to me. "I don't wish to be accused of the slightest lack of courtesy toward this woman and her unfortunate daughter." She tore the letter into small pieces, threw them away in the brazier, and went down to close forever the shutters of her drawing-rooms. After that, putting her hand to her heart, she once again remembered that she was a very sick person. But I could not even pretend to feel any compassion for her, so stunned was I in my heart by the sound of a big bell pealing full blast. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel! Surely he would be invited to Teresa's wedding! "You will surely see him again! Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. 13. Elga, I want you to meet my fiancé. A silence. Then again the laughing voice of Teresa. Don't you recognize him, Elga? Yes, I recognized him only too well, this tall young man with chestnut hair and taciturn mien. You know, Elga, Aunt Mercedes was saying in her high-pitched voice, your cousin asked me not to name him in my letter to Adelaida, so that she could surprise you herself. Now tell me, what do you think of your childhood friend? Don't you think he has grown taller, more attractive? Indeed, Daniel had become as tall and handsome as I had pictured him in my imagination, but never could my head rest upon his heart, should we ever dance together, for he was going to be Teresa's husband. I could hardly hear his first words, however, so great was the joy with which his voice filled my being. May I give Elga a kiss, Teresa? Why, yes, of course, cried Aunt Mercedes. I give you permission in any case, since it is to this child you owe your happiness. Oh, Elga, why didn't you tell us 5 years ago the reason you had tried to cut off your cousin's braids? She might have then cast on Daniel the same little glance she gave him only 2 weeks ago, and for 4 years now I would have been a grandmother. Leaning down, Daniel kissed me on the cheek. Through my memory suddenly flowed the recollection of that hurried kiss, given me 5 years earlier across a garden gate. And with pride I could not help thinking that it was through an act of mine, which I had at the time thought of no consequence, that 5 years later love had come to Daniel. Yes, his happiness was of my own doing, and all of a sudden I felt a great bliss, as if it were me, in a way, he was marrying too. 14. How short seemed to be the time of Teresa's engagement, and how I created the illusion for myself of prolonging it by expanding the designs I was embroidering on the linen of her trousseau during the long evenings of Daniel's courtship. Every afternoon at 5 o'clock exactly, Aunt Mercedes would open the door that separated the drawing-room from the veranda where I was busy with my handwork. Daniel will be here in a few minutes. You may entertain him, Elga, until Teresa comes down. A few moments later, Daniel would appear on the veranda, carrying a little box of sweets and a large bunch of flowers. He always gave me the sweets, but kept the flowers in his hand, as the bouquet he intended for Teresa, and he liked to offer it to her himself the minute she made her appearance. And each time I was afraid that Teresa might make fun of this ceremonial, which was the same every day. But each time, however, Teresa took the flowers and thanked him with her most tender smile. And whenever that happened, I could not help thinking of her uncontrollable laughter on the night I had told her of Daniel's passion for her. Could anyone possibly have passed from scorn to love in such a short time? How and why had her heart changed? I kept asking myself continually, not daring to speak to her about it. For there was no longer any intimacy between Teresa and myself, and soon I discovered that the idea of having me come had originated entirely with Aunt Mercedes. From the moment of my arrival, on the contrary, Teresa barely spoke to me, and by her coolness discouraged all advances on my part. And yet, how much I actually enjoyed those long afternoons when she was playing the piano for Daniel in the big drawing-room. Under strict orders from Aunt Mercedes, the door of the drawing-room was always left open on the veranda where I was doing my embroidery, a little chaperone, discreet and so grateful to be allowed to keep watch over love. And that is how, bending over my needlework, I enjoyed the presence of Daniel, kept busy turning the pages of the music Teresa played. Teresa used to play for hours, seemingly forgetful that she had her fiancé seated by her side on the edge of the bench. She played, and at her touch everything she played assumed a melancholy and distant tone, was like a long sigh, serene and sad. And I enjoyed that music which sounded like a plaint in the moonlight, so completely was it in accord with the sweet agony of my heart, and with the twilight slowly tinging blue the window panes of the veranda, until I found myself, with my work and my dream, entirely submerged in the darkness. Behind me the piano almost always stopped playing at that moment, and listening attentively, with heart beating and eyes closed, I would delay the time of lighting the lamps, so as to receive in thought on my lips the kiss I knew Daniel was giving Teresa in the shadow of the drawing-room. Daniel! Daniel! In order to get used to his happiness, he too might have liked, perhaps, to prolong the brief period of his betrothal. For when he was with Teresa, he almost always seemed lost, in an awkward, admiring silence, giving the impression that he did not fully realize or even believe that his dream had come true. His shyness, his stiffness, his forgetfulness reached a point which could hardly be imagined. 1 hour before leaving for the church, he suddenly discovered that he had forgotten to have the names engraved inside the wedding rings. And so it was with the point of my needle that Teresa, already draped in her wedding veil, had the charming idea of herself engraving hurriedly the name inside the gold ring which he was to place on her finger at the altar. That gold ring fated to remain buried in the mud at the bottom of the lagoon, where she was to be drowned only 1 month later. 15. For we had not yet fully realized that Teresa was married when already she was gone, taken away by Daniel. And we were only just beginning to get accustomed to the idea that Teresa had gone out of the daily routine of our lives, when already she was back, lying dead on her maiden's bed, her 2 emaciated hands crossed on her bosom. Her closed eyelids were resting heavily on 2 bluish, livid circles, and with nose pinched and mouth fallen, her entire face had an expression so sad that all those who had known her before stood dumbfounded, overcome by a strange terror. That expression, no one had ever seen it on her while she was alive, nor could anyone, except possibly me, ever have associated it with her or reconciled it with the pearly laughter and her carefree joyousness. Her tragic death, likewise, was so entirely out of relation with the happy, commonplace life, which should have been hers, that it became necessary for everyone to relate and repeat over and over again all the circumstances of the accident. She was drowned, yes. She was rowing all by herself toward the middle of the lagoon. Merely for amusement, of course. One does not find much entertainment on an estate lost in the middle of the woods while the husband is busy at the mills. Her foot must have slipped. She did not know how to swim, and she was drowned, yes. When they found out that she had disappeared, the rowboat had been adrift on the waters a long time, and people raised their hands to heaven, uttering suppressed sighs, while they surrounded Daniel with hypocritical curiosity. But standing still and staring hard at the dead woman, Daniel's attitude was such that nobody dared distract him with the slightest word of condolence from his terrifying contemplation. 16. As soon as her daughter had been carried away, Aunt Mercedes retired to her own quarters, closed the shutters, and went to bed. Thereafter she refused to leave her room, where she remained all day long in the dark, inert. For her sorrow was one of those that the light of the sun might turn into violent despair. And it was while waiting for time, doctor, and priest to bring her back to normal life that my uncle decided to turn over to me the management of the house and the care of the linen. From the moment when I saw him walking out, his shoulder helping to support his wife's coffin, I should have considered Daniel gone forever out of my life, together with the dead woman. But somehow, an expectation of something, I did not know what, accompanied by an absurd premonition of happiness, made me continue, without any feeling of bitterness, to mend all the old linen on the veranda, where, only a month before, I had been embroidering the fine trousseau of Teresa. Until one day that thing happened, which I had been waiting for without knowing it. A distant ring of the front doorbell, steps in the hall, and the door of the main drawing-room opening with a great clatter. Then Daniel standing very close to the chair where I was sewing. "Helga, I've come. I had to see you, Helga. To see all this." Suddenly his voice died away. "Sit down, Daniel. Uncle Arturo has been expecting you for a long time," I heard myself saying in a most natural manner. And from that day on, Daniel came back every week. Every Saturday he would arrive at the same hour he had been in the habit of coming during his courtship of Teresa. He would come through the drawing-room, open the door to the veranda, and sit down without saying a word. The evening would go by slowly, and all the time I kept sewing, filled with the happiness of his presence, while he stayed there smoking by my side, lost in grim reverie. "Speak, tell me something," he said at last, as the darkness enfolded his silence and mine. And I would talk to him about our common childhood, of our games of long ago, and of all those years of my life I had lived away from him. I told him stories out of my fairy books, and of the magic countries where I used to travel at night. By and by, I came to speak to him about Teresa. At that moment I felt his attention sharpening in the dark. But when, with memory and imagination exhausted, I stopped talking, he remained silent, as though unable to find words to repay my fervor. Yet I could feel his silence bringing me closer to him, as close, perhaps, as his most intimate confidences would have brought me. In this way the entire summer went by. The first Saturday of August brought Uncle Arturo a letter from Aunt Adelaida. It is most astonishing, really, that after I practically brought up the child, I should be deprived of her at the time when I need her the most. The same day, at 5 o'clock exactly, Daniel's ring at the front door found me busy packing my trunk. The moment I heard him, I stopped my work, and there I stood, expecting against my better judgment the impossible miracle to happen of which I had been dreaming all morning. Daniel, in a commanding tone, telling me, "You will not go away, Helga. You are my child, my friend, my sister. I'm taking you under my roof." In the silence of the first floor, I suddenly heard some kind of precipitous running, then a voice, "Helga! Helga! Helga!" For a moment I did not realize that it was Daniel calling me. Never had anybody needed me enough to call me with such an anxious voice. Again I heard precipitous steps, this time on the stairway, and almost immediately Daniel appeared on the threshold of my room. I looked at him, astonished, while he was catching his breath, little by little, like someone who had just been badly frightened. "You were there? Why didn't you answer me?" I kept silent, bewildered at seeing him in my room, only 2 feet away from Aunt Mercedes lying in her bed. "You weren't on the veranda, nor your sewing things either. I thought you were gone." "I'm going away this evening. Didn't the maid tell you when she opened the door?" Daniel shook his head and stared at me. "Oh, that's because she's new, and—" I began to explain, when he interrupted dryly. "Why are you leaving?" "Aunt Adelaida is feeling very ill, so—" "So she is in need of a nurse, while they no longer require a seamstress," he concluded, cutting me short again. "It isn't my fault," I murmured after a silence, not realizing actually what I was saying. It was then he came close to me, and, putting his hand on my shoulder, almost knocked me over with happiness, as with a great blow. "Helga," I heard him say in an angry voice, "will you marry me?" I was looking at him, stunned, feeling the room whirling around, when suddenly Aunt Mercedes was standing there in front of us. "What did you say, Daniel?" she cried hysterically. "I was asking Helga to marry me," Daniel replied quietly, and I noticed then there was hatred in the look he gave her. "But your wife, Daniel! Have you forgotten her so soon? Didn't you ever love her, that unfortunate daughter of mine?" "God is my witness that I have never loved anyone but Teresa, and I still love her with all the strength of my soul," Daniel declared in a solemn, heavy voice. "There, you see, Helga, you see, you little schemer. This boy does not love you," Aunt Mercedes said, turning quickly to me with an expression of joy in her eyes and in her voice that it frightened me. Excuse me, Señora, Daniel interposed. It is true that I do not love Elga, but I will give her a home where she won't have to sew, and I won't have to be alone any more in that hacienda, in all that mist. Elga, he repeated, taking me forcefully in his arms. Elga, will you marry me? As my only answer, I let my head drop on his heart, as I had so often done in my dreams. Whilst in the throes of the most violent fit of rage I ever witnessed, Aunt Mercedes cried out, Out of my house, you ingrate, you intriguer! I throw you out, both of you, out of here, both of you!